Hello there, John Kuturillo here, the life coach of your listener. Thank you for joining me for another episode. Today I'd like to discuss the topic of why I don't necessarily follow one specific framework or one specific philosophy or theory when I'm conducting life coaching. Now, I have discussed this in another form in my previous content. I'd like to specifically discuss it in this context today. As usual, I will clarify this is not advice of any kind. If you do have concerns about yourself or somebody else, please seek professional guidance. However, this is a perspective that some might find useful, and I'd also like to clarify that I'm not criticizing the mental health profession for the sake of criticizing. I'm not negating the value at all, but as with any social service or science, it is necessary that we constantly critically evaluate what we hold to be true so as to ensure that we're not biasing our perspectives and that we're always learning and maintaining the best possible practice. So please consider today's discussion to be a perspective on this. I've discussed in the past the role of frameworks, not just in helping professionals such as counseling and life coaching, but also in science and also in daily life. The human mind, in summary, tends to function best when it has some type of external objective standard by which it can judge situations and derive information. When we have a framework to guide activity, it makes life easier and more logical and ordered. However, as I've also discussed, sometimes it can restrict our thinking in ways that are not adaptive to the situation. Now, if you have seen a therapist or a coach of some description, you may notice that they tend to work within a particular framework in that the interactions that you have with them or the interactions you see them having, the way they discuss certain issues and similar, tend to have some common aspects. Certain frameworks might posit that all problems, for example, or certain types of problems have common causes. They might prescribe the types of questions you should be asking clients when they present, or a certain structure of the intervention or particular mode of service that you're offering. So, for example, it might posit exactly how the professional relationship should begin, what activity should take place towards the center, and then how the termination process should take place. Or it could be a combination. Some frameworks leave a lot more interpretation to the individual practitioner to allow them to customize them. Others tend to be a lot more rigid. Some prescribe a specific course of treatment. Others are intended to be used as needed. And what I've noticed about life coaching is that it does tend to draw on philosophical and spiritual frameworks at times, or perhaps some frameworks that are not necessarily used in contemporary or even the psychotherapy of the not too distant past. And that's not a criticism in and of itself, but it is relevant to the discussion. These frameworks provide a guiding principle by which we can structure our work, and it brings order. But there are multiple problems with this, and this is why I don't follow one specific framework. I do have structures, but I don't follow one specific framework or one specific theory. The first fact that we have to acknowledge, both for practical reasons and for humility, is that Mother Nature is more complex than anything a human can create. Mother Nature will always know more about how the world works than humans do. And remember that theories and frameworks are only invented by humans to help understand the world. It doesn't mean they're all illogical, it doesn't mean that they're all false. What it does mean, though, is that they are used to help us overcome our limitations. One of the main human limitations being that we can't possibly know everything about nature. So that's the limitation of frameworks. And if we assume that one framework can possibly explain all human problems and be used to solve them, the likelihood is that we are missing something. Another problem is that a framework needs to be relatable and make sense to a client. A client, once you've had a discussion with them using a particular framework to understand their problems, they need to be able to use that discussion to practically understand the problem from their own perspective. They need to be able to follow your dialogue and understand within themselves what the proposed cause of the problem is, how it could be manifesting in their lives, and then how it could potentially be solved. I have seen therapists in the past, had experience with therapists trying to fit clients' problems into their framework, and that's an extremely problematic way to practice, because if the framework doesn't make sense to the individual client, or it doesn't seem relevant to the problems, the client may or may not react well, but you're taking a considerable risk. Some of the common risks would be that the client feels that the practitioner is not adequately listening to, understanding, and being able to describe or explain what the client is describing in terms of their own problems. And that may make them feel quite rejected. It may make them feel as though they're unheard. It may make them feel helpless. It may make them feel intimidated, because if they have any particular fear of authority and see the practitioner as an authoritative figure, then they may be afraid to confront them on this particular matter, and that can lead to a range of other consequences. It's going to diminish the likelihood that the client is able to take action, because if they cannot clearly see how what you're proposing explains their problem, then they may not see a point in undertaking any further activity to try and solve the problem for themselves. Sometimes it can even completely change the topic of therapy, which is what sometimes happens when a therapist listens to a client's entire description of what they're experiencing, but then only focuses on one small part of that description. And by reducing the problem to that one small part and then focusing on that instead of the entire situation, the client may feel towards the end of therapy that their problem hasn't been adequately understood and addressed, because they may simply feel, how did the therapist come to the conclusion that one particular part of what I described was my entire problem when there were so many other concerns that I hadn't addressed? Another concern that I have, which seems to be more prominent in life coaching, I haven't seen this as much in conventional therapy, is that a lot of, I'll say alternative practitioners, because not all of them identify as life coaches, are starting to propose an idea that all forms of traditional Western medicine and traditional psychotherapy are completely wrong, and they're designed to mislead people so as to force them to spend more money on pharmaceuticals, or to force them to spend more money on traditional therapy. It's designed to keep people reliant. And to counteract that, they propose that there's an entire philosophy that explains all of human suffering, or all of possible human problems, and that if people just follow that one philosophy and the guidance of the practitioner very closely, that they will be able to revolutionize their lives. I can't speak to the reason that certain therapies work and certain therapies don't. That's a matter for a different discussion, and it's not something about which I'm going to be making accusations. But I do have a concern about this, because, again, Mother Nature knows more about the world and people than we do. It seems to me the likelihood is that people become attracted to certain therapies because they resonate with them, or certain frameworks, certain theories for explaining the world and similar. It may make sense to you, but for a practitioner to then generalize that and say, well, it resonates with me, therefore this must explain all of human suffering, and people are only trying to hide it because they want to benefit from more mainstream practices. Again, you're allowing yourself to be subject to your own cognitive bias. You're allowing yourself to bias your perspective and lead yourself to believe that just because something feels correct to you, that it must be correct for everyone. And this is something that concerns me as well, because a lot of New Age practice completely ignores traditional psychology knowledge, which has been developed over many years, and we know from evidence that our biases can severely affect how we think. It's not inherently bad, we're only human, but for us to allow those biases to manifest by proposing what seem like relatively simple solutions to complex problems, we're not doing what's in our client's best interests. What's also important to note is that a lot of New Age practice promotes courses. Now, I have this to say on this matter. This is my professional opinion. Not everybody's problems are going to require exactly the same level of intervention. They're not going to require exactly the same solutions. Not everyone is going to require an entire course, and they don't need to incur what that course costs either. Some people might only need 1 or 2 sessions with a life coach, and I can't promise that this will be everyone, but I have had clients who have only needed 1 or 2 sessions. Some people might need to form a longer-term professional relationship with their life coach to work through more complex problems. Every client is different. I don't believe there is one framework that applies to every client, and I don't believe it's ethical to be selling people on the idea that if they just follow one course that all their problems will be solved. It's not that simple to revolutionize someone's lives. And let me tell you, a psychiatrist or a psychologist who have studied for half a decade or more will never make those promises, even to someone who's not presenting with a mental illness. So such claims can be problematic, and I urge professionals to be very careful about making them. But I also acknowledge that most professionals are ethical in their practice and recognize the limits of theory and recognize their own limits, and I thank you for doing that, because in the end it's in society's best interests. So that being said, My approach is to first allow the client to describe their problems and what they would like to achieve in terms of life change in their own way. And then the both of us use a special process by which we analyze the problems and explore what the client experiences when they experience those problems, their thoughts, their feelings, their actions, their bodily experience, the viscera of it. And this can involve analysing both the past and the present, both of which can be extremely important. Based on that, we can then choose theories or techniques that best explain the problem and guide finding solutions. Now, none of what I do is new. It's based on psychology knowledge that's been developed over a considerable number of years. I'm not a psychologist myself, but we need to understand that life coaching and psychology and counseling and other traditional forms of psychotherapy are not completely separate fields. A life coach can only know so much about the mind as what psychology researchers have been able to establish through their research. That's the purpose of research, to make the most objective possible discoveries about the mind. And really, if we are to guide people effectively, we need to use evidence-based techniques. So I'll admit that what I do is not revolutionary in terms of the theory. The feedback that I've received has been my delivery, and the way that I work with my clients has been incredibly effective, and I do take a lot of pride and passion in the work that I do. I take clients' feedback in earnest and modify my approaches based on what the client needs. And I listen carefully and ensure the whole process is collaborative so that the client is always satisfied that we are addressing the problems that they would like to address. And I also appreciate my relationship with the client. Even though it is a professional relationship, I acknowledge that the client is giving up their time and their money to see me. So I want them to receive the best possible service. And by building such relationships, I'm increasing the likelihood that the client is going to be able to make sense of what we discuss and actually take action, be motivated to keep taking action. So thank you for joining me for another episode. As per usual, please seek professional advice if you have concerns about yourself or somebody else. Do not take what you see on the internet as gospel. If you have any thoughts on what I've discussed today or on any topic, please feel free to contact me, whether you disagree or whether you agree. I very much value your contributions, and if you have something to contribute, I would love to discuss collaborating with you on an episode. Until next time, take care.